What a day for Roald Dahl fans then. He would have been 100 today. There have been celebrations of his life, commemorations of his work up and down the land and in many, many schools. How much do you think you know about Roald Dahl? Well, a new book, Roald Dahl's Marvellous Medicine, reveals Dahl's inspiration for his gobblefunk language, his invention that made it into the medical journal The Lancet, and that he was an active vaccine campaigner. His former doctor, Liverpool University professor Tom Solomon, joins me now. Tom, good evening.
Good evening.
On Roald Dahl's birthday, what would he have been doing?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I love that little piece on from the school that you just had. I think he probably, of all the things he could have done, I think he probably would have been at a school. And in fact, this morning I was staying with my sister Penelope Solomon, who lives in Hackney. She's an actress and a comedian, and they asked me would I like to pop into the local school, Simon Mark's school. And I was quite busy because I had some TV work coming up and radio, as you can imagine. But I thought, no, of all the things I should do today, I should take this up because it's exactly what Roald would have done. And I went in there and chatted to the children about Roald Dahl and a little bit about his medical work. And it was fantastic. It was a really great way to spend the morning and a lovely little school. And you know, I hadn't planned to do that at all. And it was just a sort of spontaneous thing that he would have done.
Tell me when you first met Roald Dahl, how it came to happen.
Well, I was a junior doctor in 1990 working in Oxford, and I knew that he was in hospital. I knew he'd been unwell, and I was the junior doctor on the ward that evening. And I actually met him on the ward, and I was actually quite busy working away on the ward computer, writing up some research I'd been doing on brain infections in Africa. And I was aware that this patient, it was quite late at night, and I was aware that somebody had walked past and come back again a few moments later, and then back again, slower and slower each time. And then eventually I realised this person had stopped, and I heard this deep booming voice saying, "What are you doing?" And I looked up, and there was this tall man there, wrapped in his dressing gown with big sticking out ears and twinkly eyes. And it was almost like looking up at the BFG. But it wasn't the BFG, of course, it's the BFG's author, Roald Dahl himself. And we started chatting. He wanted to know what I was doing, and I was working on malaria, and he'd had malaria. He'd lived in Africa. And it was clear that he was fascinated in medicine. And after a while, when I worked out who he was, he said to me, "And have you read any of my books?" And I said, "Well, I haven't read any of your books, but I saw the film of The Jungle Book, and I really loved that." And of course, The Jungle Book, as you know, is not by Roald Dahl at all. It's by Rudyard Kipling. And he looked at me strangely for a minute or two, trying to work out whether I was completely ignorant or was just teasing him. And then he decided this was a big joke, and he roared with laughter, and we really became friends after that. And of course, I had read some of his work. But I think he was, you know, sometimes people who are very well known get a bit fed up with everyone fussing and fawning over them. And I think what he liked about me was that I was just getting on with what I was doing.
And of course, you could talk about medicine. He had a surprising amount of medical knowledge, which I didn't realise. Did it stem from what happened in his own family?
Well, to some extent, but he'd always been interested in medicine, and he always said if he wasn't a writer, he would have liked to have been a doctor. So he always had this fascination. But I think then things happened really sort of increased his interest. First of all, his plane came down in the Second World War, and he was badly injured through that, and he recovered in hospital, and it made him very aware of nurses and how important they are and how kind they can be. And then there were some illnesses in the family. One of his children had hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain. And the treatments back then were not very good. People would put a shunt in, but the shunt kept blocking, the valve in the shunt kept blocking. And he said, you know, we must be able to do something about this. And the neurosurgeons at the time sort of said, well, I wouldn't know what to do, or, you know, and I'm far too busy. And so he set about designing a new valve with a toy maker, actually, who he knew. And they devised, and the neurosurgeon worked with them, and they devised a completely new valve for treating water on the brain. And it became a great success. They published in The Lancet, like you said, and thousands of these were made and used on children all around the world, which was, you know, an extraordinary success.
I remember watching interviews with him when I was quite young. He came across as a little bit tetchy, a bit irascible, not someone you would want to cross. I mean, how do you remember him? What sort of man was he with you?
Well, I think that's a good point, because he could come across a bit like that. For me and for others on the ward, he was totally the opposite. He could not have been nicer. He was, you know, as you can imagine, in hospital we see all sorts of patients, and sometimes people who are as nice as pie once they get ill and things are getting a bit choppy, they turn into pretty nasty people. Or, you can understand it. They're tense, they're anxious, they're upset. So I do understand that. But Dahl was the opposite. As you say, some people found that he was a bit tetchy and argumentative. But we found he was a delight, and he was great fun to have on the wards. He'd get up to all sorts of tricks and mischief, and he would tease the nursing staff, and we had great fun, actually, which is surprising when somebody is so poorly.
How much of what his first wife, Patricia Neal, went through informed his interest in what happened to the brain and how the brain could be cured or healed?
Well, he was fascinated by medicine, and especially the brain. This came through in some of his writing, even some of his early writing. I don't know if you remember the short story William and Mary, where somebody has effectively died, but their brain gets cut out and preserved in a basin of fluid. And to write that, he'd had to do some really good research into how you could actually do it. And then Patricia, his first wife, Patricia Neal, the actress, had a stroke. And afterwards, she couldn't talk, she couldn't walk. And back then, there wasn't much rehabilitation. And he said, well, surely we must do more than just an hour a day or whatever they were offering. Because he said, she's like a child, and you would never teach a child on 1 hour a day. So he set up a program with neighbours and friends in Great Missenden where they were living. And she got 6 hours a day teaching, and she recovered. She got her speech back. She could walk again. And of course, it was amazing. And everybody wrote in, other stroke patients in the family said, how did you do it? And so he wrote a pamphlet about how he thought you should treat stroke, rehabilitate and don't wait around. You have to get on with it as soon as possible. And he worked very closely with a woman called Valerie Eaton Griffiths, who lived in the village. And then people were so interested that the treatment got made into a book. And then eventually, and more people took this approach up, and it ultimately resulted in the formation of the Stroke Association, which again, I think is extraordinary. And in fact, the Stroke Association is one of the 6 charities that are benefiting from the author's proceeds from the book. They're all going to charities that are working in areas that Roald Dahl was interested in, including SHINE, which is the spina bifida and hydrocephalus charity, the Stroke Association, Roald Dahl's Marvellous Children's Charity, which was set up by his wife, who did tremendous work there, and then also the Encephalitis Society, because one of his children had measles encephalitis. What
did his friendship teach you, do you think?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question. I think what it showed me was that here is somebody who was an author, and yet he wasn't going to be confined by that. If he saw a problem that needed solving, be it a medical problem, then he didn't mind getting stuck into that. And I guess it taught me in a way, not to be restricted by the boundaries. And in some senses, the tables have turned, because I'm a doctor, I'm a researcher, as you know. And when I set about writing this book, or even talked about it, people said, well, you're a doctor and a researcher, why don't you stick to what you know? But I wanted to write a book to introduce people to some of this medical science. And I thought, if I base it around Roald Dahl's interest in his writing, it will reach an audience that otherwise may not pick up a book like this. And that's already happening. It's sold out on Amazon, unfortunately. They've managed to stock some more, but it got down to 0, and they've put some more on, and it's available in Blackwell's and Waterstones and all the major booksellers.
Tom, it's been great to have you on to tell us a little bit more about Roald Dahl, things that I guess we just wouldn't have known otherwise. So many, many thanks. Tom Solomon is author of this book, Roald Dahl's Marvellous Medicine.